Have you ever chosen what people think about you over what God asks of you? Have you stayed silent when you should have spoken? Have you pretended not to care about your faith because someone might laugh? That small moment, that tiny choice, has a name: human respect. And according to St. John Bosco, it is the first trap on the road to hell. On May 3rd, 1868, in Turin, Italy, a priest woke up screaming. His hand was swollen. The skin on his palm was peeling off. He had touched the outer wall of hell in a dream. Not a dream like yours or mine. A vision so real that his body bore the marks the next morning. The priest was Giovanni Melchior Bosco, known to the world as Don Bosco, a man who spent his life saving street boys from prison and despair. And that night, God showed him what happens to souls when love for God is replaced by love for human approval. If you value documented Catholic saint history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using direct sources from the biographical memoirs of St. John Bosco published by the Salesian Congregation, volumes 7 through 10, which contain first-hand testimonies from witnesses who lived with the saint, including John Bosco, who documented Don Bosco's prophetic accuracy under formal oath, and Father Joseph Pius Martin, who served as his secretary and transcribed the vision the morning after it occurred. Now back to the information. Don Bosco was born on August 16, 1815, in a stone cabin at Becchi, a hamlet near Turin in the Kingdom of Piedmont. His father died when he was 2 years old. His mother Margaret raised 3 boys alone, farming and shepherding to survive. John learned to read from the parish priest. He taught himself magic tricks from traveling circus performers. At 9 years old, he had his first prophetic dream. A voice told him he would spend his life not with blows, but with charity and gentleness, drawing wild boys to virtue. He remembered that voice for 73 years. On June 5, 1841, John Bosco was ordained a priest in Turin. The Industrial Revolution had turned the city into a furnace. Factories ran on child labor. Boys as young as 12 worked 16-hour shifts cutting stone, laying brick, hauling coal. Turin's population had exploded from 60,000 in 1800 to 135,000 by 1840. The new arrivals were country boys, farmhands, shepherds. They came looking for work and found exploitation. Wages were kept deliberately low. A stonemason earned 3 lire per day. A mason's apprentice earned 50 centesimi, barely enough for bread. When the work dried up, they slept in doorways and stole bread. Don Bosco visited the prisons with his mentor, Father Joseph Cafasso. The Generala, Turin's main prison, held over 400 miners in 1841. They were crammed into cells built for half that number. No windows, no ventilation. Tuberculosis spread like fire. Don Bosco saw cells packed with boys aged 12 to 18, healthy when they entered, skeletal within months, intelligent boys who had never learned to read, covered in lice, beaten by guards, waiting to be hanged or shipped to forced labor camps in Sardinia, where most died within 2 years. He spoke to them. They told him their stories. A boy named Carlo, 14 years old, arrested for stealing a loaf of bread, sentenced to 5 years hard labor. A boy named Pietro, 16, caught sleeping in a church, accused of vagrancy, sentenced to 3 years. A boy named Domenico, 13, orphaned when his parents died of cholera, living in the streets, arrested for begging, sentenced to 2 years. None of them had been to Mass in months. None of them knew how to pray. None of them believed anyone cared whether they lived or died. Don Bosco walked out of that prison and made a decision. He would stop them before they got there. He would create a place where boys could work, learn, pray, and belong. A place where they would not be numbers or criminals or problems. They would be sons, and he would be their father. On December 8th, 1841, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, Don Bosco was vesting for Mass in the sacristy of St. Francis de Sales Church when the sacristan grabbed a ragged boy by the collar and threw him out. The boy screamed. Don Bosco heard it. He called him back. The boy's name was Bartholomew Gorelli, 16 years old, from Asti, looking for work. Don Bosco asked him if he knew how to pray. Bartholomew said no. Don Bosco said, "Come back tomorrow." 3 days later, Bartholomew brought 9 friends. 3 months later, there were 25. By summer of 1842, there were 80. The oratory had begun. Finding a place to meet was a war. Don Bosco rented a field. The landlord evicted him. He borrowed a church basement. The neighbors complained about the noise. The boys were too loud, too poor, too dangerous. Municipal authorities accused him of organizing a revolutionary cell. They tried to have him committed to an asylum, twice. His own brother told him he was insane. Don Bosco kept moving, room to room, building to building. For 4 years, the oratory had no home. In 1846, Don Bosco found an abandoned shed in Valdocco, a slum district of Turin. Next door was a tavern. Across the street, a brothel. The shed sat on the burial ground of the martyrs of Turin. Don Bosco bought it with borrowed money. He dug the floor deeper and turned it into a chapel. On Sundays, 500 boys crammed into a space built for 50. They sang, they prayed, they played in the courtyard. For the first time in their lives, someone wanted them. Don Bosco's mother, Margaret, left her village home and moved to Turin in 1846. She was 61 years old. She cooked for the boys. She washed their clothes. She slept on a bench. She never complained. When boys stole from her, she said nothing. When they cursed at her, she smiled. She called them her sons. She died in 1856, surrounded by boys who wept like orphans, because that is what she made them feel like, loved. By 1851, Don Bosco was housing, feeding, and teaching 400 boys. The oratory ran on faith and debt. Don Bosco borrowed from everyone who would lend. Marquis Fossati gave him 2,000 lire in 1849. The Marchesa di Barolo, his former employer, gave him 500 lire in 1850. Local merchants donated fabric, leather, flour, firewood. When the donation stopped, Don Bosco went door to door begging. He was not ashamed. He was desperate. The boys needed to eat. He opened workshops. Shoemaking in 1853. 20 boys learned to cut leather, stitch soles, craft boots that sold in Turin's markets. Tailoring in 1854. 15 boys learned to measure, cut, sew suits for merchants and nobles who paid in advance. Printing in 1856. Don Bosco bought a used press for 300 lire. He taught boys to set type, mix ink, bind pages. They printed catechisms, prayer books, textbooks, pamphlets. Within 2 years, the print shop was producing 10,000 pages per month. The boys earned wages. They sent money home to their families. They saved for their futures. They had dignity. He signed apprenticeship contracts, the first of their kind in Turin, guaranteeing fair wages and humane conditions. A shoemaker's apprentice earned 2 lire per day, twice the city average. A tailor's apprentice earned 1 lira 50 centesimi. A printer's apprentice earned 2 lire 50 centesimi. The contracts prohibited work on Sundays. They required daily religious instruction. They included meals and lodging. Employers tried to cheat the boys. Don Bosco took them to court and won. In 1855, he sued a textile merchant who had withheld wages from 3 apprentices. The merchant claimed the boys had damaged fabric. Don Bosco produced witnesses who testified the fabric was defective when delivered. The judge ruled in Don Bosco's favor and awarded damages of 50 lire, which Don Bosco distributed equally among the boys. He published catechisms, textbooks, and a newspaper printed entirely by his boys. The Catholic Readings, launched in 1853, reached a circulation of 4,000 by 1855. It printed lives of saints, moral stories, instructions on the sacraments, and defenses of Catholic doctrine against Protestant attacks. The boys wrote some of the articles themselves. They set the type. They operated the press. They bundled the copies. They distributed them across Turin. They were not just workers. They were collaborators in a mission. By 1856, the oratory had 150 permanent residents and 800-day students. Don Bosco knew their names. He knew their birthdays. He knew which ones struggled with anger, which ones struggled with impurity, which ones struggled with pride. He heard their confessions. He celebrated Mass for them every morning. He ate with them. He played with them. He stayed up late when they were sick. He wept when they died. He was not a distant administrator. He was their father, and they were his sons. On December 18, 1859, Don Bosco and 22 companions founded the Society of St. Francis de Sales. They took their name from the saint known for gentleness. The Salesians would not use fear or punishment to teach. They would use reason, religion, and kindness. Pope Pius IX approved the order on March 1, 1869. By the time Don Bosco died, there were 764 Salesian houses across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. But Don Bosco was not just a teacher. He was a seer. He had dreams that predicted deaths, warned of danger, and revealed the state of souls. On February 1, 1865, he announced to the oratory that one of the boys would die soon. He did not say who. On March 16, 1865, Anthony Ferraris received the last sacraments and died. John Bisio, who assisted at the deathbed, later swore under oath. Don Bosco told us many other dreams concerning oratory boys' deaths. We believed them to be true prophecies. We still do, because unfailingly they came true. During the 7 years I lived at the oratory, not a boy died without Don Bosco predicting his death. But the dream that shook the oratory to its foundation came in the spring of 1868. It was Holy Week. Don Bosco had been having nightmares for several nights. He told the boys they exhausted him. He woke up feeling like he had been working all night. On the night of April 10th, 1868, he delayed going to bed until midnight. He was afraid to sleep. He sat at his desk reading. He finally went to bed, sitting upright against the headboard, hoping he would not dream. He fell asleep anyway. A man appeared beside his bed. Don Bosco called him the man with the cap, or the guide. Some thought it was an angel. Others said it was St. Francis de Sales. Don Bosco never clarified. The guide said, "Get up and follow me." Don Bosco resisted. The guide grabbed his arm and pulled him into the vision. They walked through a desert. empty, desolate, silent. Then the landscape changed. A wide, beautiful road appeared, lined with green hedges covered in roses. The road looked flat, but it sloped downward. Don Bosco felt like he was being carried by the wind. In front of him, he saw the boys of the oratory, all of them. He recognized their faces. Some were running, some were walking, some were laughing. Then he noticed something on the ground, thin threads, almost invisible, like spiderweb. The boys began to stumble. Their feet caught in the threads. They fell, and when they fell, they were dragged backward down the slope toward a furnace in the distance. Don Bosco asked the guide, "What are these threads?" The guide said, "Look closer." Don Bosco bent down. Each thread was a trap. Each trap had a name written on it: pride, disobedience, envy, impurity, theft, gluttony, sloth, anger. He saw boys getting caught in them one after another, pulled down the slope like fish on a line. Then he saw boys running faster than the others. They were not just tripping, they were being yanked. Don Bosco asked, "Why are they moving so fast?" The guide answered, "Because they are dragged by the snare of human respect." Don Bosco stopped. "A mere nothing," the guide said. "Just plain human respect." Human respect. The fear of what people think, the need to fit in, the shame of being different. It was not labeled a mortal sin. It was not listed among the commandments, but it was the first trap, the one that pulled boys toward all the others. Because once you care more about what people think than what God thinks, every other sin becomes easier. You lie to protect your reputation. You steal to impress your friends. You abandon prayer because someone might mock you. You hide your faith because it makes you look weak. Human respect is the trap that opens the door to all the rest. Don Bosco bent down and picked up one of the threads. He pulled. He felt resistance. He pulled harder. The resistance grew stronger. He realized he was not pulling the trap closer. The trap was pulling him down. He kept pulling. He found himself at the mouth of a cave. He looked down into the darkness. He kept pulling. A huge, hideous monster emerged from the cave, clutching a rope. All the traps were tied to that rope. The monster was pulling them all at once. Don Bosco let go. He turned to the guide. "Now you know who he is," the guide said. "I surely do," Don Bosco answered. "The devil himself." The guide showed Don Bosco that among the traps there were also knives and swords scattered on the ground. A providential hand had placed them there. Boys who grabbed these tools could cut themselves free. The biggest knife was for the trap of pride. It was called meditation. Don Bosco saw boys who stopped, picked up this knife, and sat quietly examining their consciences. They saw their pride for what it was: vanity, arrogance, the worship of self. They cut the thread and walked free. Another large knife was for spiritual reading. Boys who read the lives of saints, the Gospels, the writings of the church fathers found their minds cleared. They saw the world differently. They understood that holiness was possible. They cut the thread of ignorance and walked free. There were two swords. One represented devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, especially frequent Holy Communion. Don Bosco saw boys who received communion weekly. Some received daily. They knelt before the tabernacle. They adored Christ, present in the Eucharist. And when the threads of sin tried to bind them, the power of the sacrament burned through like fire through rope. They were freed not by their own strength, but by the strength of God himself, present in the host. The other sword represented devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Boys who prayed the rosary, boys who wore the scapular, boys who consecrated themselves to Mary's Immaculate Heart. Don Bosco saw them walking the road, and when they stumbled, a woman clothed in light appeared and cut the threads before they could tighten. Mary, the Mother of God, defending her children. There was a hammer. It represented confession. Don Bosco saw this tool used more than any other. Boys who went to confession weekly, boys who went monthly, boys who confessed their sins with honesty and contrition. The hammer struck the threads like an anvil breaking chains. Each confession shattered another trap. Each absolution freed another soul. The priest's words, "I absolve you," were not symbolic. They were effective. They destroyed the power of sin. They severed the connection between the soul and the devil who held the rope. There were smaller knives for devotion to St. Joseph, St. Aloysius, and other saints. Boys who asked for their intercession. Boys who imitated their virtues. Boys who remembered that they were not alone in the fight. The communion of saints was real. The dead were not gone. They were alive in Christ, and they were fighting for the living. Some boys saw the tools. They grabbed them. They cut the threads. They freed themselves. Don Bosco watched them turn around and walk back up the slope, away from the furnace toward the light. They were saved, not by their own merit, not by their own power, but by the grace of God made available through the sacraments and devotions of the Church. But most did not. Most kept running, kept stumbling, kept getting dragged. Don Bosco watched boys he knew by name fall into trap after trap. He saw a boy named Francesco caught by the trap of disobedience. Francesco had sneaked out of the dormitory 3 nights in a row to meet friends at a tavern. He thought it was harmless. He thought he could handle it. The thread tightened. He fell. He was dragged down the slope. He saw a boy named Giovanni caught by the trap of impurity. Giovanni had looked at forbidden images. He had entertained evil thoughts. He had gone to confession but had not been honest. He had minimized his sins. He had made excuses. The thread tightened. He fell. He was dragged down the slope. He saw a boy named Antonio caught by the trap of pride. Antonio was intelligent. He knew it. He reminded everyone of it. He mocked boys who were slower to learn. He refused to accept correction. He thought he knew better than his teachers. The thread tightened. He fell. He was dragged down the slope, and he saw dozens caught by the trap of human respect. Boys who had stopped praying in public because their friends laughed at them. Boys who had stopped going to Mass because it was not fashionable. Boys who had hidden their faith because they wanted to fit in. Boys who had compromised their values because they feared rejection. The thread tightened. They fell. They were dragged down the slope faster than all the others. The guide led Don Bosco further down the road. The roses disappeared. Thorns took their place. The road became steeper. At the bottom, they reached an enormous building, dark, silent, towering. The entrance was a massive iron door, locked tight. Above the door, an inscription, "The wicked will go to the everlasting fire." Don Bosco felt terror rising in his chest. The guide said, "Do not be afraid. Only those already judged fall into hell. You have not been judged yet." A group of boys came hurtling down the slope. The doors opened. The boys fell inside. The doors slammed shut. The guide said, "Let us go in." Don Bosco pulled back. The guide took his hand and stepped through the gate. They entered a corridor. At the far end, a huge crystal pane. Through the pane, Don Bosco saw a vast hall. The walls were covered with inscriptions. "He will give fire to their flesh so that they burn eternally. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. There is no order here, but rather eternal horror dwells. The smoke of their torment goes up forever." Through the crystal, Don Bosco saw boys he knew, boys from his oratory. He saw their faces twisted in agony. He saw them screaming, but he could not hear them. The guide said, "This is their present state. This is where they would go if they were to die now." Don Bosco cried out, "How can we save them?" The guide said, "They have superiors. Let them obey them. They have rules. Let them observe them. They have the sacraments. Let them receive them." Don Bosco begged, "Let me write down their names so I can warn them." The guide said, "Do you really believe some of them would reform if you warned them? Your warning might impress them, but soon they will forget it, saying, 'It was just a dream,' and they will do worse than before. Others, realizing they have been unmasked, will receive the sacraments, but this will be neither spontaneous nor meritorious. Others will go to confession because of a momentary fear of hell, but will still be attached to sin." Then the guide lifted a veil. Beneath it, Don Bosco saw more boys. Above them, an inscription, "Radix omnium malorum," the root of all evils. Don Bosco asked, "Is it pride?" The guide said, "No, it is disobedience. Disobedience is the root of all evil. Adam and Eve were driven from paradise for this sin." The guide explained. The boys Don Bosco saw were those who disobeyed, who left their dormitories at night to wander dangerous areas, who went to church but daydreamed or caused disturbances instead of praying, who pretended to pray but dozed off, who skipped church entirely, who read forbidden books instead of singing hymns. Disobedience, the refusal to submit to God, to the church, to parents, to superiors. It was the sin that made all other sins possible. The guide then showed Don Bosco another chamber. Above the entrance, an inscription, "The Sixth Commandment." Don Bosco saw boys he knew, boys who had confessed sins of impurity but had lied about the number of times, boys who had committed such sins once in childhood and never confessed them out of shame, boys who confessed but were not truly sorry, boys who spent their time in the confessional, figuring out how to deceive the priest. The guide said, "Anyone dying in this frame of mind chooses to be among the damned, and so he is doomed for all eternity." Don Bosco saw the walls of hell, 1,000 walls glowing red, each one hotter than the last. He asked, "Can I touch one?" The guide seized his hand, forced it open, and pressed it against the first wall. The sensation was excruciating. Don Bosco screamed. He jerked his hand back. He woke up in his bed, sitting upright, clutching his hand. It was stinging, burning. He rubbed it, trying to ease the pain. When he got up that morning, his hand was swollen. The skin on his palm was peeling off. He had touched hell. And his body remembered. On Sunday night, May 3rd, 1868, the feast of St. Joseph's patronage, Don Bosco gathered the boys of the oratory. He told them the dream. He did not hide anything. He did not soften it. He said, "Bear in mind that I have tried not to frighten you very much, and so I have not described these things in all their horror as I saw them and as they impressed me. We know that our Lord always portrayed hell in symbols because, had he described it as it really is, we would not have understood him. No mortal can comprehend these things. The Lord knows them, and he reveals them to whomever he wills. The boys listened in silence. Some wept, some trembled. Don Bosco looked at them and said, "Do not be afraid. None of you are in hell now. This vision shows where you would go if you died in your current state. But you are alive. You can change. You can cut the threads. You have confession. You have communion. You have the Blessed Virgin. Use them." One boy asked, "Father, what is human respect?" Don Bosco answered, "Human respect is when you do not do what is right because you fear what others will think of you. It is when you want the respect of others before all else. It is when you hide your faith, your prayers, your obedience to God because you are ashamed. It is the first trap because it makes you value the opinion of men more than the will of God. And once that happens, every other sin follows." Another boy asked, "How do we avoid it?" Don Bosco said, "You must decide who you serve. If you serve God, you will lose the approval of the world. The world hates what it does not understand. Sin wants company and disdains the saint. If you treasure different things than the world treasures, the world will be annoyed. But remember what awaits you for following Jesus, a rich reward, not in this life, but in the next." He paused. Then he said, "When you are reproached for the name of Christ, you are blessed. It means that the Spirit of God is resting upon you. Do not fear human respect, fear God, and love him more than you love the opinions of men." If you value documented Catholic saint history like this, make sure you subscribe. Comment which part of this story struck you the most. Now back to the information. Don Bosco's vision was not a fantasy. It was a documented reality. Father Joachim Berto, the priest to whom Don Bosco entrusted copies of his prophecies, testified that the saint's dreams came true with unfailing accuracy. John Bissio, who lived at the oratory for 7 years, swore under formal oath that every boy whose death Don Bosco predicted died exactly as foretold. The vision of May 3rd, 1868, was recorded in the biographical memoirs of St. John Bosco, Volume 9, pages 166 through 181. Published by the Salesian congregation, compiled from first-hand testimonies of witnesses who lived with the saint. Don Bosco did not claim the vision to frighten boys into obedience. He claimed it to wake them up. He wanted them to see what was at stake, not rules for rules' sake, not religion as ritual, but the eternal destiny of their souls. He wanted them to understand that the small choices mattered, the little compromises, the quiet betrayals of conscience, the moments when they chose approval over truth. Those moments had consequences. Not later. Now. Every time you chose human respect over God's will, you tied a thread around your ankle, and the devil was holding the other end. Don Bosco continued his work. By 1872, he had founded the Daughters of Mary Help of Christians with St. Mary Mazzarello, a religious order for girls. By 1874, he had established the Salesian Cooperators, a lay organization to support his work. He built churches, schools, workshops, orphanages, printing presses. He traveled to France, Spain, and across Italy, raising funds and recruiting priests. He was exhausted. His health failed, but he did not stop. On December 25th, 1887, Don Bosco took to his bed. He knew he would not get up again. He called his Salesians to his side. He said, "Do not ever forget these 3 things: devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, devotion to Mary Help of Christians, and devotion to the Holy Father." On the morning of January 31st, 1888, as the Angelus bell rang across Turin, Don Bosco whispered the names of Jesus and Mary. Then he died. His funeral was attended by thousands. The streets of Turin were lined with people who wept, rich and poor, nobles and beggars, boys he had saved and men he had taught. They called him their father, because that is what he was, not just to the boys of the oratory, but to the broken, the abandoned, the forgotten. He had loved them when no one else would. He had seen them not as problems to solve, but as souls to save. And he had given his life to do it. Pope Pius XI, who had known Don Bosco personally, beatified him on June 2nd, 1929. He canonized him on Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1934. He gave him the title Father and Teacher of Youth. In 1949, Pope Pius XII proclaimed him patron saint of Catholic publishers. His feast day is celebrated on January 31st. But the vision of May 3rd, 1868 remains. It is still read in Salesian houses across the world. It is still studied by spiritual directors and confessors. It is still used to teach young people the stakes of their choices, because the traps are still there. Pride, disobedience, impurity, gluttony, sloth, anger, and human respect. The first trap, the one that leads to all the rest. You're standing on that road right now. The roses are still there. The threads are still there. The tools are still there. Confession, communion, the Blessed Virgin, meditation, spiritual reading, devotion to the saints. You can grab the tools and cut yourself free. Or you can keep running and hope you do not stumble. Don Bosco spent 73 years teaching boys how to cut the threads. He spent 47 years running an oratory that never turned a boy away. He spent 29 years leading a religious order that spread across 5 continents. He spent his entire life showing people what love looks like when it refuses to compromise. And on May 3rd, 1868, he was shown what happens when love is replaced by fear, when the approval of men matters more than the will of God, when human respect takes the place of divine love. The vision was not a threat, it was a warning, a merciful warning. Because God does not want anyone to fall, he wants everyone saved. But salvation requires a choice, and that choice begins with a simple question. Who do you serve? The world or God? The opinion of men or the truth of heaven? Human respect or divine love? Don Bosco answered that question every day of his life. He chose God. He chose the boys no one wanted. He chose poverty over comfort, sacrifice over ease, obedience over applause. He chose to be mocked, evicted, accused, and exhausted. He chose to love when love was inconvenient. And because of that choice, hundreds of boys were saved. Thousands of souls were formed. Millions of people across 2 centuries have been inspired. The trap of human respect is still waiting. The threads are still on the ground. The devil is still holding the rope. But so are the tools. Confession is still available. Communion is still offered. The Blessed Virgin is still interceding. The choice is still yours. Don Bosco would tell you this. Do not wait until you stumble. Grab the tools now. Cut the threads before they tighten. Do not fear what people think. Fear what happens when you stop caring what God thinks. Because that is when love dies. That is when the soul begins its descent. That is when human respect becomes a noose instead of a thread. And remember what John Bosco swore under oath. Every prophecy came true. Every boy whose death Don Bosco predicted died. Every vision he described came to pass. The vision of hell was not imagination. It was revelation. God allowed Don Bosco to see the consequences of sin so he could warn others, so he could pull boys back from the edge, so he could teach them that the small compromises matter, that the quiet betrayals accumulate, that love for God and love for human approval cannot coexist. One pushes out the other. One leads to freedom. The other leads to chains. On January 31st, 1888, Don Bosco died in the same room where he had welcomed Bartholomew Gorelli 47 years earlier. The oratory that began with one ragged boy had grown into a worldwide movement, but the mission never changed. Save souls, love the unloved, show them that God has not forgotten them, and teach them that the only opinion that matters is the one that waits for them at the end of the road. The road is still there. The roses are still blooming. The threads are still hidden in the grass, and the choice is still the same. Human respect or divine love, the approval of men or the will of God, the easy path that slopes downward or the steep climb that leads to heaven. Don Bosco saw what happens when you choose wrong. He touched the wall. He felt the heat. He woke up with the marks. And he spent the rest of his life making sure no one else had to. In the archives of the Salesian congregation in Turin, there is a register of apprenticeship contracts signed by Don Bosco between 1851 and 1860. Each contract is signed by the employer, the apprentice, and Don Bosco himself. They are among the first labor protections ever documented in Italian industrial history. One contract dated February 8, 1852, on stamped paper costing 40 cents, guarantees a 14-year-old boy named Giuseppe Rossi fair wages, humane hours, and the right to attend Mass on Sundays. At the bottom, in Don Bosco's handwriting, a single line. This boy is my son. Not legally, not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the refusal to let another soul fall through the cracks of a world that valued profit over people. That contract is still there, yellowed, fragile, but intact. And at the top, in faded ink, a date, February 8th, 1852. Exactly 16 years before Don Bosco touched the outer wall of hell and learned that love, when it forgets God, becomes the first trap on the road to perdition.